You are not struggling to make money. You are unconsciously pushing it away every single day through patterns you don't even realize you're repeating. And the worst part is, the harder you try to fix your financial life using logic, strategy, and effort, the more you reinforce the exact internal state that keeps wealth out of your reach. That's the paradox no one tells you. Because if effort alone created wealth, the hardest working people would already be rich. But they're not. So something else is happening. Something invisible, something psychological, something that quietly decides whether money moves toward you or keeps escaping you no matter what you do. And this is where the idea becomes uncomfortable. What if your financial reality is not controlled by what you do, but by what you radiate? Not in a mystical sense, but in a deeply psychological one. Because long before money becomes a result, it becomes a response. A response to how you think, how you feel, what you expect, and more importantly, what you tolerate. This is exactly where Napoleon Hill's ideas start to become dangerous if you really understand them. Because when he talks about attracting wealth, he's not talking about wishful thinking or blind optimism. He's pointing to something most people ignore. The fact that your subconscious mind is constantly broadcasting a pattern, and that pattern shapes your perception, your decisions, and ultimately, your results. But here's the contradiction that should bother you. If people already know about mindset, why do they keep getting the same results? Why do they read books, watch videos, repeat affirmations, and still feel stuck in the same financial position year after year? That question alone reveals something critical. Because if knowledge was enough, change would be immediate. But it's not. Which means the problem is not what you know, it's what you are operating from without awareness. And this is where the concept of aura becomes practical instead of abstract. Your aura is not some invisible energy field in a mystical sense. It's the sum of your repeated internal states. It's your emotional baseline, your default expectations, your automatic reactions to uncertainty, risk, and opportunity. It's how you interpret reality before you even consciously think about it. And here's the unsettling part. Your aura is always active. You don't turn it on and off. It's constantly influencing how people perceive you, how you perceive opportunities, and how you respond to them. So now a deeper question starts to form. If your aura is always active, what exactly is it signaling right now? Because most people assume they are trying to grow, but internally they are operating from fear, scarcity, hesitation, and doubt. And those states don't just affect how you feel, they shape what you see, which means two people can look at the exact same situation and experience completely different realities. One sees opportunity, the other sees risk. One moves forward, the other freezes. One attracts momentum, the other reinforces stagnation. And the situation didn't change, the perception did. Now stop and think about the implications of that. If perception changes action, and action creates results, then perception is the real leverage point. But here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Perception is not something you consciously control most of the time. It's conditioned, it's trained, it's automated through repetition, which means your current financial behavior is not as intentional as you think. It's a continuation of patterns you've been reinforcing for years. And this creates the first psychological trap. Because if your perception is filtering reality before you even analyze it, then maybe you're not missing opportunities because they don't exist, but because your internal system doesn't recognize them as opportunities. And that leads to a dangerous cycle. You look for external solutions, but your internal filter stays the same. So the results stay the same, which reinforces the belief that nothing works, which further conditions your perception. And now you're stuck, not because of lack of effort, but because of a loop you can't even see. So the real question stops being, how do I make more money? And becomes, how do I change the internal pattern that decides what I see, what I choose, and how I act? Because if that pattern doesn't change, everything else becomes temporary. You might even get lucky. You might find a short-term gain, but eventually you'll return to your point of origin. And your point of origin is your aura. Now, this is where most people get it wrong. They try to change behavior directly. They try to force discipline, force productivity, force action. And for a while it works. But then something pulls them back. Old habits return. Old fears resurface. Old decisions repeat. And they interpret that as failure. But it's not failure. It's consistency. Consistency of identity. Because behavior always aligns with what is familiar, even if what is familiar is keeping you stuck. So now we're getting closer to the real problem. You're not fighting a lack of knowledge. You're not fighting a lack of opportunity. You're fighting a deeply rooted internal pattern that has been shaping your perception, your decisions, and your results for years. And until that pattern is interrupted and reprogrammed, nothing truly changes. But that leads to an even deeper and more uncomfortable question. If your aura was built through repetition, emotional patterns, and reinforced beliefs, then who trained it? Was it you? Or was it your environment, your past, your experiences, your fears? Because if you didn't build it consciously, then you're operating inside a system you didn't design. And that realization changes everything. Because now you're not just trying to improve your life, you're trying to take control of something that has been controlling you without permission. And that's where the real work begins. But before you change, you need to see clearly, and most people don't. Because your aura doesn't just influence what you attract, it also determines what you reject, what you ignore, and what you avoid without even noticing. And when you start to notice that, you realize the problem was never just money. It was about the version of you that money responds to. Now this is where things start to move out of the uncomfortable and into the dangerous. Because the moment you begin to understand that your aura is shaping your perception, the next realization hits even harder. Your perception is shaping your decisions long before logic even has a chance to step in. And if that's true, then most of what you call rational decisions are actually emotional patterns manifesting in disguise, which raises a question most people avoid because it threatens their sense of control. Are you really making decisions, or are you just repeating them? Because if you slow down and observe your financial behavior, a pattern starts to emerge. It's not random. You don't sometimes hesitate or sometimes act. You follow a script, a predictable sequence. You become interested, feel the possibility, then doubt appears, then hesitation, then delay, then distraction, and in the end, inaction. Or the opposite, you feel urgency, jump in too fast, ignore signals, overcommit, and then deal with the consequences. Different behaviors on the surface, same root cause, an internal state that was already defined before the decision even showed up. And this is where the loop tightens even more, because if your internal state defines your perception, and your perception defines your action, then your results are simply reinforcing what was already happening inside you, which creates a closed system. You feel scarcity, act with caution, miss opportunities, and that result confirms the scarcity. You feel urgency, act impulsively, make unstable decisions, and that result confirms the instability. Either way, your reality keeps proving your internal state right, even when it's the very thing keeping you stuck. So now the idea of training your aura stops sounding abstract and starts becoming precise. Because what you're really doing is interrupting that loop. You're breaking the automatic chain between feeling, perception, and action. But here's the part most people underestimate. You can't break a pattern you don't notice while it's happening. Awareness after the fact is not enough. Reflection after the mistake is not enough. Because by the time you realize it, the decision has already been made, and the pattern has already been reinforced. So the real shift begins at a different level. Not at action, not even at thought, but at emotional recognition in real time. The moment where you feel hesitation before you justify it. The moment where you feel fear before you call it being careful. The moment where you feel expansion before you start overanalyzing. That moment is where your aura is active in its rawest form before logic reshapes it into something acceptable. And this creates a new kind of tension, because once you start noticing these moments, you realize something uncomfortable. Your biggest limitation is not lack of opportunity, it's your automatic reaction to opportunity. And that reaction feels real. It feels justified. It feels like you, which makes it even harder to challenge. So now the question becomes sharper. If your reactions feel natural, how do you change them without feeling like you're forcing something fake? This is where most people fail, because they try to replace one behavior with another without changing the underlying state. They try to act confident while feeling uncertain. They try to take risks while internally expecting loss. And that creates friction. And that friction eventually breaks consistency, which is why people start strong and then fall back. Not because they lack discipline, but because their internal state never actually changed. Only their surface behavior did. And this is exactly what Napoleon Hill was pointing toward when he emphasized repetition, emotional intensity, and belief. Not as motivational tools, but as conditioning mechanisms. Because your subconscious does not respond to logic alone. It responds to what is repeated with emotional weight, which means your aura is not trained by what you understand. It's trained by what you emotionally experience over and over again. Now think about what that implies. If most of your emotional patterns around money are tied to stress, fear, pressure, or urgency, then every time you think about money, you're reinforcing a state that repels stability. Not because money itself is negative, but because your internal association with it is. And that association becomes your baseline. So even when opportunity appears, it doesn't feel like expansion. It feels like risk. And when something feels like risk, your system tries to protect you. And protection in this context often looks like hesitation, delay, or avoidance, which you then interpret as overthinking or lack of clarity, when in reality, it's your aura maintaining its current pattern. Now here's where the shift begins to take shape. If your aura is built through repeated emotional states, then changing it requires creating new emotional references, a system to interpret opportunity differently, which takes time, repetition, and awareness. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it, not just hear it. How many opportunities have you already seen in your life that you didn't act on, not because they were bad, but because they didn't feel right in the moment? And what if that feeling wasn't intuition, but conditioning? If that question makes you uncomfortable, it should, because it challenges one of the most trusted signals you rely on, your own perception. And once you start questioning that, you open a door that most people never walk through. At this point, you're probably starting to see your own patterns more clearly. And if you are, then this is the moment where I want you to pause for a second and engage with this, not passively consume it. If this is making sense, if you're recognizing parts of your own behavior in this, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and more importantly, leave a comment describing one pattern you've noticed in yourself while listening to this. Not for engagement, but because the moment you put a pattern into words, you make it visible, and what becomes visible becomes changeable. Because what we're building here is not just understanding, it's awareness in motion. And that brings us to the next level of this idea, the one that most people never reach, because it requires something deeper than knowledge. It requires confrontation. Confrontation with the version of yourself that has been silently maintaining your current reality. Because once you see the pattern, you have a choice, and that choice is where everything starts to change. At this point, something should feel different, not because you learned something new, but because you're starting to see something you couldn't see before. And once you see it, you can't go back, because now the pattern is exposed. The hesitation is no longer just hesitation. The overthinking is no longer just analysis. It's your aura protecting the identity you've been unconsciously reinforcing. And this is where everything connects. You were never really chasing money. Money was the response to your baseline, to what feels normal, to what you repeatedly confirm through your emotional patterns and decisions. which means the real question was never how do I get more, but what version of me does money respond to consistently? That shift changes everything, because now you stop chasing outcomes and start observing identity. You stop forcing behavior and start tracking patterns. You stop asking, what should I do, and start asking, from what state am I about to act? And for the first time, you're not reacting blindly. You're seeing the process while it's happening. But here's the part most people underestimate. This doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels slow, subtle, because you're not changing results yet, you're interrupting patterns. And that requires conscious repetition, especially when it feels unnatural. But that's exactly the point. Your old aura was built the same way, through repetition and emotional reinforcement. Now you're doing it with awareness. And this is where the shift happens. The moment a new response stops feeling forced and starts feeling natural, your baseline changes. And when your baseline changes, your perception changes. Your decisions follow. Your results follow. Not instantly, but inevitably. This is what people call attraction. But now you see it clearly. It's alignment. Alignment between your internal state and your actions, between what you expect and how you move, between who you are and what you allow yourself to experience. From the outside, it looks like things finally started working. But from the inside, you know the truth. You didn't just change what you do, you change what feels natural. And that's where most people stop, because it requires something uncomfortable: ownership. Ownership over your patterns, your reactions, your internal state. Because once you take ownership, you lose the illusion that external circumstances are the main limitation. And that's uncomfortable. But that's also where your power is. So now we return to the question that started all of this. If your aura is always shaping what you perceive, what you choose, and what you attract, what are you going to keep reinforcing after this moment? Because now you know. You know that repeating the same patterns recreates the same reality. You know that waiting to feel ready keeps you stuck. You know that what feels natural right now might be exactly what's been holding you back. So this is no longer about information. It's about decision. The decision you make in the next moment when the old pattern shows up. The hesitation, the doubt, the urge to delay. That moment is the test, not tomorrow, not when everything is clear. But right there, do you repeat or do you interrupt? Because that single choice, repeated enough times, is what reshapes your aura. And once your aura changes, your entire trajectory changes with it. If you made it this far, don't let this become just another idea that fades. Comment below and answer honestly. What is one pattern you are no longer willing to repeat after today? Subscribe to the channel if you want to keep going deeper into ideas that actually change how you think and act. And if this shifted your perspective, leave a like, because that tells me you want more content that challenges you, not just entertains you. Because in the end, this was never just about money. It was about becoming someone who no longer needs to chase it.